So glad to have everybody here. I'm sure a few folks will join us even in a few minutes. We are going to learn the second half of a section of Talmud from Bava Metzia. Now, last week, and the recordings, I believe, are online on the B'nai Yeshurun's YouTube channel. I know that the first one was on there. I hope the second one is on there as well. And in that session last week, we sort of talked about what Talmud is and where it comes from and stuff like that. And so I wanted to just take a few minutes and talk about this specific tractate. So this tractate is called Bava Metzia, which is translated as the middle gate, which of course should be totally clear to everyone about what that's about. No, I'm just kidding, definitely not. It's not obvious on its surface. Bava Metzia is part of a three sections, Bava Kama, Bava Metzia, and Bava Batra, which translate to sort of the first gate, the middle gate, and the last gate, something along those lines. And they're each part of the order. Remember, there are 6 orders of the Talmud. They're part of the order called Nezikin, which is translated as damages. So this whole section, these tractates within the order are all about what happens when our lives interact with each other in a civil way, right? As distinct from perhaps criminal or religious. It's what happens classically when my ox gores your ox. Like, what do we do? How do we resolve that? And this whole section is all about that. And Bava Kama and Bava Metzia and Bava Batra all sort of speak to those issues. Classically in Bava Metzia is the section on lost objects. Right? What do you do when you lose an object? What happens when you find an object that seems lost? This section speaks to that. And so these are all the things, the subjects that talk about the daily living, right? The rabbis understood that our life is not just the ritual religious moments, but also the more mundane stuff. Like, how do we live with each other? How do we navigate all of those issues? That's what the Talmud comes to speak to, this section as well. So what I'd like to do is the following. I'm going to share my screen and review what we did last week, so that if you weren't here, or even if you were, we're all sort of on the same page. And then I'll open it up for some comments and conversation. And you know, for some of you who might be percolating it on the last week or initial questions, we'll have some time to do that. And then we will continue on with the text since we didn't finish it. We're not in a rush, so we will get as far as we get. You know, we're going to learn whatever we learn. There's always something to draw on. So unless anyone has any questions before I do that, or comments, which I certainly would love to have, we'll jump right in. Okay, cool. I feel free also to use the chat. It doesn't distract me. So if you want to have a side conversation there, please feel free to do that. What I'd love to do is, if you can see this, I'd love for you to give me a thumbs up if you can see it in your screen. Amazing, amazing. Great, awesome. All right, we started on page 58b, right? Talmud pages are folio style, so they're A side and B side. The version we're looking at today, just as a reminder, is the Koren Steinsaltz version of the Talmud, translated into English. On the left side, ignore the boxes for the time being, the blue and the pink, and I think there's a bright green one in later. That's me. That's my edits, but you can ignore that for the time being. The left side has the Hebrew and Aramaic of the section of Talmud that we're studying. And on the right side, we have the bold text, which is the translation of that Hebrew and Aramaic, and the not bold, which is Rabbi Steinsaltz's commentary. So for example, the first sentence in the Mishnah is, just as there is a prohibition against exploitation or fraud called ona'ah in buying and selling, so is there ona'ah in statements, that is verbal treatment. So the phrase, there is a prohibition against, and verbal treatment, mistreatment, are Rabbi Steinsaltz coming in and sort of explaining and translating, originally written in modern Hebrew and translated over the last few decades. Mishnah comes from the 2nd century or so, plus or minus, and the Gemara comes over the course of the following few centuries, usually codified around the 5th century. Mishnah is primarily written in Hebrew, and the Gemara is primarily written in Aramaic, but quoting Hebrew texts. The boxes are some of the technical terms, the things that help you decode what's in the text. So here, as a review for anyone who missed it, or just good review in general, kashem kach, these first two, is translated as just as and so too, or in this case, so is, it's translated in English, which tells us it's sort of a comparison. Just as X is true, so too Y is true. And this is the core crux of the conversation we're having today, which is just as there is this thing called fraud, and here they translate it as exploitation, fraud in buying and selling in business, there is also this thing called ona'at devarim, or which is verbal mistreatment or verbal fraud or something like that. Meaning to say, right, we have these two concepts, and the existence of one proves the existence of the other. Now, whether or not you agree with that statement or not is certainly up to you. That is what the Mishnah is saying. And so it uses a couple of examples. If you are, asking someone who's selling a product, how much are you selling it for? Even if you never really plan to buy it, that would fall under this category of verbal mistreatment. You're defrauding them with your words. The other, and we spend a lot of time talking about that example. But the Mishnah offers a number of other examples. If one is a penitent, and here this is translated as a Baal Tshuva, meaning to say if someone has erred and they have done reconciliation with that error, right? They have, I don't know, you can think of the myriad of things that we all do wrong to one another, and we've restored it as best as we can. We're not allowed to then say to that person, remember your earlier deeds, reminding them of the thing that they did wrong, that they repaired, is considered ona'at devarim, verbal mistreatment or verbal fraud. And we have another example. If one is a child of converts, we may not say, remember the deeds of your ancestors, right? As it is stated, and we have a verse, and the pink is there to remind us this term, Shnei Amar. It's quoted in Tanakh, in this case from the book of Exodus, and a convert you shall neither mistreat nor shall you oppress them. This text is another example of what verbal mistreatment is. If somebody is a part of the people, of the Jewish people, regardless of how they got there, reminding them that they came from somewhere else would be considered inappropriate. It would be verbal mistreatment, right? So this is one of the reasons why we classically don't ask converts their story, their journey. We don't, sort of put them in a secondary status. Jews are Jews are Jews are Jews, to put it simply. And we'll get into that one example a little bit further. The Gemara continues by finding sources from the material. So here we have this first technical term, Tanu Rabbanan, the sages, our rabbis, Rabbanan, that's on ending with the patach, which is that flat little vowel with the nun ending, is translated as our, like new in modern Hebrew. So Tanu Rabbanan, our rabbis taught. Tanu, that phrase tav nun vav here, reminds us that it is coming from an earlier period of time. It's parallel with the Mishnah. Our rabbis taught, right? We have this verse from Leviticus: you shall not mistreat, tonu, right? In Hebrew, that's right here. You shall not mistreat a person, their colleague, right? Ish et amito. We can have a whole conversation. What is colleague? Why is it translated that way? It's related to the word am, which means peoplehood, things like that. And so the Tana, the early rabbi, explains that this verse from Leviticus, as distinct from the one above, teaches us, is in reference to this concept of verbal mistreatment. And then the Gemara goes on to sort of debate, well, is this really true? And so we have this example. Well, maybe the verse is only talking about this sort of business-related monetary exploitation, this normal monetary fraud. And the Gemara argues, no. In this previous verse, it specifically mentions monetary fraud, And so therefore, we're talking about verbal fraud here. I mean, last time we sort of had a whole discussion about whether or not we thought that was a strong enough argument. Bob, I think you made the argument that you like it to be very, linear, right? If it's not mentioned, it doesn't count, right? Okay, certainly a reasonable argument. Regardless, the rabbis are finding that argument to be substantial enough to show the existence of this concept. And then we sort of finished with this last paragraph here. Bill, I know that you weren't here last week, so I'd love for you just to read this paragraph for us, the one at the bottom of the screen, where it says how so. Is that okay? Can I volunteer you to do that?
You can, no problem. How so? If one is a penitent, another may not say to him, remember your earlier deeds. If one is a child of converts, another may not say to him, remember the deed of your ancestors. If one is a convert and he came to study Torah, one may not say to him, does the mouth that ate unslaughtered carcasses and animals that had wounds that would have caused them to die within 12 months, and repugnant creatures and creeping animals comes to study Torah that was stated from the mouth of the Almighty?
Thank you for reading that, Bill. So here, right, we get we get another example, right? So we revisit the Talmud is always drawing on the Mishnah and commenting on it. So in this case, the rabbis are asking, Ha ketzad, how does this thing work? And we have the answer, right? So if we have this quote from the Mishnah, if someone is a Baal Tshuva, is this penitent person, we can't say to them, remember your earlier deeds. And so the question is, how does that work? So what that is to say, right? And we have the other example. If a convert comes to study Torah, we can't say to them, this really kind of awful thing, right? Which is to say, right? You're Jewish, you came to study Torah, right? And we would say to them, you who came from this, who used to do all of these things, like eating treif and other creeping animals that we don't eat, like you and this mouth that did all these gross things in the eyes of the rabbis, but not really, right? You're going to come and study Torah, which is from the mouth of the Almighty, right? That is the kind of thing the rabbis are saying, that would fall into this category of ona advarim, verbal fraud. Tybal.
And isn't an extension of that principle why converts get a religious name that they're the child of Abraham and Sarah, so no one can tell in a public sphere that they're a convert because they don't have a full Hebrew name or full religious name. It's not always Hebrew.
So it's a yes and a no. The answer is yes, in the sense that, you after enough time, if you see someone with the Hebrew name Abraham and Sarah, it doesn't mean that they are a convert, but it usually hints to it. What it does tell us is that the rabbis understood that they are as if from the Jewish community, like that they can be sourced. Their ancestry is no longer what it was before. Of course, they shouldn't ignore that that they have a personal history, but that they are as if born from Jewish parents. So yes and no. Yeah, Tybal, please.
I just wanted to add, knowing where you are in the world, that one of my Talmud teachers since 1990 is Rabbi Avram Landisman, who was one of the founders of Woodside Synagogue, not far from you, if you know where Woodside is. And he was married to a Sarah. So they were Abraham, their kids are Abraham and Sarah. So right, sometimes.
Right, of course, exactly right. Which is, it doesn't work. It doesn't necessitate that someone is converted. Again, people named Abraham and Sarah are certainly entitled to, have families together. They're not precluded. But yes, exactly. Yeah, Bill, please.
Yeah, depending on how you think of it, of course, Jews ate all this stuff before we received Torah at Sinai. I mean, I know there are some Orthodox sects who feel Abraham and Sarah were keeping kashrut from day one, but practically Jews were not observant the mitzvot until receiving them, and so giving them the Abraham-Sarah name in a way reflects that you're part of the people, but you shouldn't be ashamed. Those people also ate this way and had non-halachic lives in some ways, and so maybe that's a nice thing, maybe not. I don't know.
Yeah, and that's a cool take, right? Which is to say, right? How dare we say such a thing to someone else when our ancestors on some level also did that, right? How hypocritical are we to be this sort of restrictive, as it were? And that's cool. I hadn't thought of that. That's a nice approach. Yeah, Nelson. Oh, you are not muted. Or you are currently muted. Let's try that.
Sorry. I've heard people call to the Torah who are converts, and they'll say, like, Abraham, father of us all, Sarah, mother of us all, so that that name labels them a convert. Is that inappropriate?
So it is customary that we give Abraham and Sarah, then sort of the first Jews, the parents, become the new parents, as it were, to convert. So I'm not sure I'm not understanding your question. Should we not be doing that, is what you're saying?
I'm saying is adding father of us all, mother of us all, is a way of saying, yeah, you're a convert.
Yeah, I mean, it's not.
I'm reminded of something that went on when I was younger. When I lived in Columbus, Ohio, every kid on welfare got a new clothing outfit to go to school, but they were identical. So when you went into a classroom, you saw 10 boys wearing the same shirt or 10 girls wearing the same dress, you knew that they were on welfare. It was a way of helping them, but labeling them. It was wrong. I thought it was wrong. It's wrong here.
Yeah. So I think what I'd rather draw out, other than specific examples, is the principle here, which is that we shouldn't be in the position of sort of labeling people, certainly not as sort of terribly as the person is quoted here, right? Does the mouth that ate unslaughtered, like carcasses, like that is not a nice thing to say. So certainly we shouldn't be saying terrible things, but I think we are drawing out this principle that reminding a penitent of their earlier deeds, or saying to someone, your ancestry isn't enough, is falling under this category of ona'at devarim, is somehow fraudulent and mistreating, and it creates mistreatment. Is a clearly a core principle. Let's what I like to do is the following. So this is by way of review, right? I had a teacher in rabbinical school, Rabbi Patricia Fenton, who is now the head of the Beit Midrash at Ziegler. She used to say that review is where all the learning happens. So it's always good to review. So all right, so we've reviewed this now. We're going to push on a little bit ahead. I'd love to get a volunteer, somebody who didn't get a chance to, somebody else who hasn't gotten a chance to say something yet, to read this last paragraph on the page. Somebody want to volunteer? I know I voluntold Bill before. Yeah, Eric, please.
Okay. The last one started with if, right?
All right. If torments
are afflicting a person, if illnesses are afflicting him, if he is burying his children, one may not speak to him in a manner that the friends of Job spoke to him. Quote, is not your fear of God your confidence, unquote, and your hope the integrity of your ways. Remember, I beseech you, whoever perished being innocent. Certainly you sinned, as otherwise you would not have suffered misfortune.
So great, thank you, Eric. So this is like pastoral counseling 101 on some level, right? Which is, if somebody is suffering, right? They have torment, they're being tormented in some way, they have illness, they like, God forbid, they're burying their children, right? We shouldn't act the way Job's friends acted. Who needs friends like these, who basically say, right, is not your fear of God your confidence, or your hope of integrity of your ways, right? I beseech you, whoever perished being innocent, meaning to say, right, well, maybe if you were less guilty, you wouldn't have all these bad things happen to you, right? Maybe you weren't as innocent as you appear, right? Of course, we know from the story itself that he didn't do anything wrong. He's being punished for no reason, right? His friends don't know that. And so here, we're basically saying, you brought this on to yourself. This is like a biblical example of victim blaming. You are a victim of circumstances. You are suffering, and it's ona'at devarim. It is verbal mistreatment. It is verbal fraud to say, this is probably your fault. What do people think about this? People agree? Would you put this in the same category of ona'at dvarim? What do people think? Yeah, Nelson.
I have two conflicting thoughts. One is sometimes people do bring it upon themselves. So could you say to somebody, let's say, who overate sweets consistently, you've got diabetes, probably you brought it on yourself. And the related one is there's a Christian thing that always bothered me when you would say to someone who suffers a lot that God only gives you as much suffering as you can handle. Like, why couldn't I be weak?
Right. God, I don't need to suffer this much. Like, I might be able to handle it, but I'd prefer not to.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. So I'll do the last part first, which is to say, right? There are multiple narratives about our relationship to suffering. Right? There's a whole fantastic section of Talmud. Maybe we'll learn it later on in the series, where we have this whole conversation about sort of where does suffering come from? Is it a manifestation of God's love or God's punishment? Why do bad things happen to good people? Things like that. And there are a lot of narratives and stories we tell about that. And I mean, look, if we all knew the answer, then I think life would be a lot easier, but we don't know why these things happen. And certainly, right, as human, without having to define that, as human to human, how do we interact with each other? The Gemara is certainly saying that this model isn't going to work, which is to say, this is probably your fault. That said, and Karen, I see you there. I'm going to come to you in a sec. Which is the first thing you said, which is that there's a quote from the Rambam, Maimonides, and I'm gonna paraphrase here, which is that there are three reasons why something happens. You did something that caused something bad to happen, right? Like I ate too much and now I feel sick to my stomach. Second, someone else did something and it caused something bad to happen to me, right? Meaning to say, if somebody, like a kid, I have a niece and a nephew, right? If one bonks the other one with like a plastic bat, all right, okay, somebody else did that to you, right? It's not something else happened. And the third is the world's chaos and stuff happens. Like it's not caused by your own actions here. And certainly this sort of speaks to that dynamic. Karen, did I see your hand up or no?
No, I was just like leaning on my hand.
Oh, you were just into it and focused. I like it. Bill, please.
Yeah, I think the Gemara could paint itself into a corner, possibly for one of the reasons you mentioned, because of course, if we start condemning people in this way, then as you've said, well, what happens? How do we view those who are outwardly, as far as we can tell, without sin, and yet also have these problems? That would then be an issue with this kind of approach. And also, if somebody has sinned, I mean, our religion allows for a return, right? We just spoke about that earlier. And if they return, if they stop that sinning, and yet if their affliction does not go away, if their illness does not go away, yet again, it would disprove the validity of this suggested approach. So I think the Gemara is just kind of saying, in a way, let's not get painted into a corner, as well as it's not appropriate to do.
Yeah, right. Meaning to say, there's a theological, series of issues here, which we could, get trapped by, right, backed into a corner. But also, like human, this may not be the best way you want to approach things. And I think the Gemara is certainly leaning towards that second piece, right? We're in this category of verbal fraud, and trying to define it. Yeah, Bob.
Even if a person has caused the problem for himself, it's saying you shouldn't call their attention to that. Mm-hmm. So it's just because that their problem was self-inflicted, you shouldn't make them feel worse by reminding them of that fact. Right.
So when I've eaten too much at the end of the day and my wife says to me, "I told you so, you shouldn't have had that ninth cookie," perhaps that isn't the issue. She doesn't do that, for the record, but if she had, right, that would fall, right? You're just rubbing it in at some point. Right, great. Thanks for adding that, Bob. Yeah, David.
So I think getting back to the idea that I think it might have been Nelson who brought it up of, somebody's eating tons of sweets and then they end up with diabetes. You don't throw that in their face either. I think relating that to some other things we've studied about what's the right way to reprove someone. If you can help somebody, that's one thing. And if you do it in a gentle way that maybe brings them along, as opposed to throwing a brick at them and saying, ha ha, see what you did. You ate all those sweets and now you have diabetes, rather than, what can we do to treat your diabetes and how can we help you maybe not make it worse by sneaking sweets anyway. I think what underlies both of these maybe is this idea that, your fellow human being is your fellow human being. None of us is perfect. We don't know why things happen. It's above our pay grade, so to speak. So let's not sit here and say we know why it happened, like some people are inclined to do and say, well, AIDS is a punishment for being homosexual, which is nonsense, of course, because it can affect anybody. And how can you call it a punishment? Again, it's above our pay grade. Or throw in somebody else's face some other such comment. I think that's what both of these kinds of things are coming maybe to teach us.
Yeah. I mean, look, we're clearly talking about how Job's friends spoke to Job as opposed to God, right? And how God is interacting. And so I think your example of AIDS is a really important one, right? Just let's be really specific about what we're talking about. We're not talking about a stomach ache here. We're talking about yisurim, like sufferings. We're talking about illness, chalaim. We're talking about someone burying their children. Like these are not like I ate too many cookies at the end of the day and now I feel sick. We're talking about serious suffering. I mean, not to say that like having stomach issues isn't suffering, certainly it is, but we're talking about very serious suffering and then really just making someone feel poor about it and really letting victimizing them even further. Exactly right. Let's move. I want to move a little bit further because the Gemara takes some interesting notes. I just want to point out, I'm not reading it all here, but there are notes along the page of the Talmud page. And I'm actually just going to zoom out so you can see for a moment. This is what one of the Talmud pages looks like. You can see there are notes and other kinds of things along the side. It's incredibly useful, but we're not doing that today. So another day we will dig into those. And here we have the next paragraph, and we go to a slightly different direction. Can I get another volunteer to read for us here? Anybody want to volunteer? Okay, I'll read it. Karen, was that going to be you?
Yeah.
Please. Okay. Likewise, if donkey drivers.
Right. Likewise, if donkey drivers are asking to purchase grain from someone and he has none, he may not say to them, go to so-and-so as he sells grain, if he knows about him that he never sold grain at all. He thereby causes the donkey drivers and the would-be seller anguish. Rabbi Yehuda says, one may not even cast his eyes on the merchandise for sale, creating the impression that he is interested at a time when he does not have money to purchase it. Verbal mistreatment is not typically obvious, and it's difficult to ascertain the intent of the offender as the matter is given to the heart of each individual, as only he knows what his intention was when he spoke. And with regard to any matter given to the heart, it is stated, and you shall fear your God, as God is privy to the intent of the heart.
Awesome. Thank you, Karen. All right, so we've got a couple of things happening here at once, right? Different pieces of this. And we sort of talked about them a lot, right? So we have this example of the donkey drivers, right? Someone comes to you saying, I need to purchase X, Y, and Z resource, right? And you say, oh, go to my friend, they sell it, or go to somebody and sells it, right? When you know that they haven't done that, right? So you're basically just wasting their time. And then we have the other example of Rabbi Yehuda, who takes it even a step further, right? Which is, like we saw in the Mishnah and other places, right? Don't even look at merchandise, right? Just in case you set the impression when you don't have money. Now, there's an interesting conversation here. well, if I tell the salesperson I'm not interested, I'm just browsing, or I go, window shopping, or I'm looking on the internet, is that really, verbal fraud? Here we're starting to get some around the edges, the borders here. And then we have this fascinating comment here. Rabbi Steinsaltz sort of gives us this introduction. Verbal mistreatment is not typically obvious, which I think we've encountered. And then it has this really fascinating phrase. V'chol davar, we're here reading the Aramaic, because I think it's good we should hear the Aramaic sometime, right? Oh, sorry, it starts here. Sheharei hadavar masur lalev, right? So the thing dwells in the heart, it's in the heart. V'chol davar hamasur lalev, ne'amar bo v'yirata me'elohecha, right? So anything that is in the context of heart, is related to the heart, you shall fear your God, from your God. You should have fear of your God, meaning to say, God knows what's in your heart. So even if somebody else doesn't know, you know. Now, I think this, just sharing my own view, I actually think that if something is in your own heart, it can't really be verbal fraud, because you haven't said anything. Like, we all have things and thoughts in our head. We don't always act on them. We don't say things. Does that count? I mean, that's just my sort of initial take. I don't know whether or not this really falls into this category. Yeah, Bill.
My understanding is at the time that this was written, and we see it in some of our prayers as well, we today associate emotion with the heart. But the heart back then was seen as the center. They didn't know the brain. It was seen as the center of intellect. That's where intent, your thought, would actually sit. It wouldn't be this emotional intent. It would be an intellectual intent. So I can see in that, if that's correct, I can understand here that God would know what you're thinking, essentially, not just not what you're feeling, and God would know the intent. So that's one statement. I don't know, if that's valid or not. But the other is, so we come to this point here, and clearly the courts are not going to rule on this, right? You're not going to get brought forward in front of the community in any way, shape, or form. So I'm always intrigued what the value of this entire writing is. Possibly it's communicated to the people, but my sense was when it was written, it was probably just a certain number of small people who were hearing this, and it really wasn't mass behavior modification for everybody. And so I don't know, with that statement, whether this intent is rather than thinking it's admonishing the people who are doing it, perhaps it's speaking to those who might feel themselves elevated and in some way in judgment over the people. And it's kind of saying, you shouldn't, you shouldn't be in judgment of these people. We don't have an official court in judgment, and you shouldn't be intellectually judging them. It's up to God. So those are my 2 points.
I love that. Yes. So certainly in a literary sense, the Lev is the house of the, like the home of the intellect, right? So certainly that is true. And it's interesting just to reflect on that literary nature of, like, what does that mean for us, that where we hold the heart as sort of metaphorically in the same home of emotion, of how those things are so deeply integrated. Just again, not really the subject of this conversation, but something to really think about, how they may have used the heart and we use the mind, but really how these things are really quite a bit overlapping, if not entirely the same. And so the second piece I think is so interesting, right? Which is to say, thinking of the Talmud as a pedagogical tool, right? Of those who are studying it, how we might imagine them saying, don't get haughty, right? Be humble. You're not accepted from this. Don't think you're better than anyone else, you student of Talmud. I mean, that's powerful. That's powerful. Here, certainly we're saying, like, you shouldn't think these things. I mean, we can't really control our thoughts the same way, but like imagining, right? You shouldn't have this stuff in your heart. You shouldn't dwell on it. You shouldn't act on it. You shouldn't even speak it, manifest it with words, let alone do actual monetary fraud, right? So we're starting to see like layers here, levels in which we might engage with this type of fraudulent behavior, mistreating behavior. Any other thoughts on this? I know you guys saw the first sentence of the next paragraph, and I see that you really want to be there. Yeah, Nelson.
I'm just thinking about casting his eyes on the merchandise. I'm not quite sure what's included or not included. Like if I go to a street seller, so we're out in the open, nothing's behind the case, and I look admiringly at his apples, but I don't buy anything, am I defrauding him?
I mean, I think if I'm sort of taking the position of Rabbi Yehuda, if you don't have your wallet on you and you're like really looking at these apples, right, casting your eyes on, really thinking about it, then yeah, you are defrauding the apple sales.
That's all I can do.
I'm sorry?
When I don't have my wallet, that's all I can do. I can look at them and say, oh, they're beautiful.
Yeah, I mean, I think Rabbi Yehuda is taking a very strict view, which is to say that, yeah, that might be fraudulent behavior. Now, whether or not we should agree with Rabbi Yehuda notwithstanding, Rabbi Yehuda would certainly say, right, in the extreme case. David and then Bob. And then Karen.
I guess maybe three thoughts. The simple thought might be that if we're looking for actually how to behave, or when I've studied this kind of thing, when I've studied other parts of Talmud in an Orthodox setting, the question always comes up: what's the halacha? Let's look at Shulchan Aruch, and then somebody says the halacha doesn't follow Rabbi Yehuda. So that might be one simple way out, but let's not say we want to go the simple way out. So what might points 2 and 3 be? One might be that this is kind of an extreme example to sort of point us in a certain direction, but it doesn't literally mean you have to feel like you committed a sin because you looked in a shop window when you didn't happen to have your wallet with you. And then the third thought might be more a question of context and expectation. For example, when we were on our honeymoon in Israel years ago, we were in the old city. We were walking through an Arab shop, and you know how they're arranged in the shuk. And we looked at something. We didn't really even like it. And the seller, on the other hand, interpreted looking at that as, oh, they're interested and it's just about negotiating. So we're trying to leave the store and he's trying to throw the garment at us or whatever. Was that at the honeymoon or was that happened to you?
No, that happened to me another time.
That happened to you another time. So we had something a little different on the honeymoon, but it's the same kind of thing where we didn't come from a culture where we're looking at something, but just looking at it and not really being that interested in it. Whereas from his cultural point of view, even looking at it meant you were interested and it was just a negotiating ploy that you were trying to leave. So maybe some of it's that also.
Yeah, so I think a couple of things. One is, I haven't looked at the Shulchan Aruch and whether or not the law follows Rabbi Yehuda, but let's take your word for it that it doesn't. It is interesting, right? So the Shulchan Aruch coming from an Eastern European or a Sephardic perspective, depending on which gloss and which comment you're looking at, right? And the context of this being in Babylonia, whether or not that plays a cultural role. I also want to bring up something else you said. There's this concept of a fence around the Torah. Just raise a hand if you're familiar with that concept or if you've heard it before. So, right, there's this concept of sayag l'Torah, that we're creating this fence around the Torah, meaning to say we are making choices. We sort of have a stricter ruling on something in order to not actually transgress the sin, right? So a classic example in the modern era would be not playing instruments, lest something breaks and that you fix it, right? The not playing instruments is the fence around the Torah in this case, which is not fixing something, right? Using that example again, you should take, do it halacha of your community and your rabbi, et cetera, et cetera. But here we might understand Rabbi Yehuda's position as a fence around the mitzvah here. Bob, Karen, and then Crystal. I saw your hand up briefly.
Back to Nelson's apples. if you were looking at them just because of their beauty and their size and their form, as opposed to looking at them as a buyer, that's where the matter of the heart comes in. Only you know why you were looking at them. You and God know, is the explanation that I'm getting out of this. So that if your purpose was legitimate, there is no problem. And if your purpose was illegitimate, you know that, and God knows that, even though the people around you don't know.
Nice. Meaning to say, right, if I know I don't have my wallet and I'm looking and I'm really there in my heart, right, and I know all I'm doing is appreciating the produce, right, I'm not really looking to buy it. And even if, right, the salesperson comes and says, well, would you like to buy an apple? Like, I can give you a deal, whatever. And you're like, no, thank you, right, and you walk away, right? We know in our heart that I wasn't trying to defraud them, as opposed to, I know I don't have my wallet, and maybe I can get myself a deal, I can bring it, whatever, something else, right? Only we know that, and ostensibly then God knows. Right, awesome. Thank you for that, Bob. Good nuance there. Karen and then Ron.
Yeah, what I wanted to say is pretty much what Bob said, that last sentence is intent, that what matters is intent. But I also want to just tell David that I felt like that's the only time I ever get a bargain in the shuk, is when I've just glanced at something and the guy is yelling after me this super low price and I didn't even want the thing.
Yeah, haggle culture, right? Haggle culture has a very specific.
But they know when you really want something, and they don't seem to haggle as much.
Yeah, it's a real irony that, and I've heard it said that, without getting us too far off track, but I've heard it said that they actually like when Americans come because we think we've haggled, but from their point of view, we overpaid because we're just used to seeing a price, unless it's a car or a house or something like that.
Seems like a win-win on all counts, right?
Yeah.
Everybody feels good about that. It's a dynamic. All right, Ron, and then we're going to read the next paragraph.
I was just wondering if this falls under this. It's kind of the opposite thing. I was the buyer. It happens to be a car. I was buying a car. And I walked into a dealer. I said, I know exactly what I want. I know what color I want. I already have test driven the car elsewhere. I know what options I want. Give me your best price, and we're not haggling. Whatever you tell me, it's either going to be a yes or a no. And of course, they want me to test drive it. And I said, no, I've test driven. And they start fooling around with the prices, and I blah, 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 and blah. And I finally just got up and walked out. And by that time, the manager comes running after me in the parking lot. I said, sorry, you lost your chance. You didn't give me your best price right off the bat. You're wasting my time. And by the time I drove home, the price came down $3,000. I still didn't buy it from him. So does that fall under this? Because it's kind of the opposite side of this.
Well, I think in most, other than the donkey drivers, I do think that the majority of the circumstances is where we are the buyer. So I don't know that it's opposite necessarily. Well, let me turn the question back on you, Ron. Do you think it fell into this category?
Yeah, they wasted my time. I wasn't wasting their time. They wasted my time.
Right. I see what you mean by opposite. Right. Which is that you came in with good intent and hopefully simplicity, and they didn't take you at your word, or they tried to sort of potentially onat devarim, right? This verbal interaction. It's a good question. I mean, I don't know. I mean, I can't decide for everybody. And as we learned from this paragraph, only Hashem really knows, right? Perhaps they were meeting you with the right intent, and we just don't know, and maybe not, right? We just don't know. But it's a great example.
They were meeting me like I was any buyer walking in, not one that already knew exactly what he wanted.
Yeah. I mean, certainly. I mean, that action certainly seems to be the case from the story that you told, right? And it might be that their intention was that they were trying to do the best work that they can do, which they think they can do a particular way. Regardless, it's a great example of these are not clear-cut circumstances, right? There's tension here. Let's move on a little bit. I want to there's a couple of pieces here that I want to pull, and because we have a little we don't have as much time because we had a really good conversation. I'm gonna draw out a handful of things in here. We're not going to read all of it, but all of this is available online. You can look it up on Safaria, and I'm happy to drop a link into the chat before we leave. So I'm just going to sort of pull out a couple of things I want us to talk about, and then we'll talk about it at the end. So first is, I want to point out this term mishum. Does everybody see that? There's a blue box. So the rabbis have this concept that they always want to teach in name of the person who taught it, right? Everybody gets credit for their intellectual property, if you will, right? And so the rabbis are very serious about always speaking in the name of here. In this case, I wanted to highlight here, mishum, in the name of. So Rabbi Yochanan teaches in the name of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, or Ben Yochai as it's translated here, right? Greater is ona'at dvarim, the transgression of verbal mistreatment, than the transgression of monetary mistreatment, of ona'at mamon, of a monetary fraud, right? As with regard to this verbal mistreatment, it said, and you shall fear your God. With regard to that, monetary exploitation, it's not stated, and you shall fear your God. Means that if we looked in the verse that we were quoted above, the verses from Leviticus, we'd see that you shall fear your God is included when it comes to verbal mistreatment and not monetary mistreatment. So I'm going to just scroll back here for a second. We can look at it together. Here we can see, and you shall not mistreat tonu, a person, their colleague, and you shall fear your Lord, Leviticus 25:17. That one's in regard to verbal mistreatment. But the other verse from Leviticus, and if you sell to your colleague an item that is sold or acquired from your colleague's hand, you shall not exploit tonu, their sibling. From Leviticus 14, the phrase, and you shall fear your God, is not there. Okay, scrolling back down. Sorry, I know it's moving quick. So Rabbi Yochanan, in the name of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, is saying, verbal mistreatment is worse because we have this fear of God phrase in reference to it. Right, so that's a marker, according to Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, that this is worse. And Rabbi Elazar adds an additional explanation. Verbal mistreatment affects one's body, but that monetary exploitation only affects one's money. Rabbi Shmuel Bar Nachmani goes on to say that monetary exploitation, monetary fraud is given restitution, means you can pay somebody back, you can give them back the thing, but a verbal mistreatment is not given restitution. There's no way to repair it, right? And again, the question is, what does that look like? And here is the context. What does that really mean? What does not given restitution really mean? And then I want to point out this phrase where it says Tanei Tana, right here. The Gemara relates that a Tana who recited Mishnah or Braitot in the study hall taught, meaning to say there's this actual person called a Tana, not just the category of rabbis, who would literally be like a human recording device. They would memorize the Mishnah and they could recite it on demand. So the Gemara relates this story that a person, a Tana, is reciting Braitot, teachings from the same period of the Mishnah, before Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak, meaning to say that it's being said in front of him. Anyone who humiliates another person in public, it is as though they were spilling blood. People might have heard this before, right? And here, how do we know that this was accepted? Rabbi Nachman Bar Yitzchak says, or Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak rather, says to him, the Tana, you have spoken well, meaning to say, I approve of this message, right? It's like a political ad, right? Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak approves of this message. You have spoken well, as we see that after the humiliated person blushes, the red of the blushing leaves their face and pallor comes in its place. They turn white, which is tantamount to spilling their blood, right? So here, it's getting even more serious. Humiliating someone in public, treating them with verbal mistreatment, like maybe Job's friends or something like that, right? It's as if you killed someone. And we know that because it's in their body, which we got quoted above from Rabbi Elazar. I hear somebody typing. I don't know who that is. Let's see if I can. I'll just mute everybody again here. I'm not sure what's going on. Okay, hopefully that helps. All right. And then here we have another quote, right? We should, what Abaye said to Rav Dimi. I know I'm going fast at the end, but I really want you guys to see this, right? We have this quote. Abaye says to Rav Dimi, in the West, which Babylonia is east of Eretz Israel, in the West, what mitzvah did they keep very vigilantly? Rav Dimi says, not humiliating others. As Rabbi Hanina says, everyone descends to Gehenna but 3, except for 3, which is, they have this whole conversation that comes next, which we're not going to read today, is these categories of people who basically suffer forever, right? So the question of whether or not like Jews believe in hell, like these are the states, the conversations that sort of bend that truth. But basically, right, here, anyone who has sex with a married woman, right, this is a serious offense to the rabbis. One who humiliates another in public, and one who calls another a derogatory name. These people are the ones that suffer forever. These are the ones that we treat with not seriousness per se, is not the right phrase, but rather that we take what they had to say very seriously. I want to show you one last thing, and then we'll talk about it as a group, which is here it is at the very end, the last section in this whole section, and then it goes on to a different subject. And Mar Zutra Bar Tuvia said that Rav says, and some say, because the rabbis are so certain, they want to make sure they got the right person. And so maybe it wasn't those people, it was Rav Chana Bar Bizna says, Rabbi Shimon Chizda says, so they're not sure who says it. And then, they go on to potentially with somebody else. It is more comfortable for a person to cast themselves into a fiery furnace than to humiliate another in public. Right, meaning to say it's easier for someone to, or it's better for someone to harm, to put themselves into harm as opposed to humiliate another. And then they give a proof text from the story of Tamar, right, which we're not going to read now. Which is to say, we talked a little bit about this category. What is it? How does it work? What falls into the category? We talked a little bit about the limits, but we ended with, and I know we went through it quickly, please forgive me, the stakes. It matters. Treating someone poorly with our words, humiliating them, is as if killing them, right? Reputation is one of the few things any of us actually have. Ruining someone's reputation is tantamount to almost killing them. Now, it doesn't say reputation, so that's me sort of bending what the words are. But certainly, the rabbis are clear that the stakes of verbal mistreatment are not reparable the same way as a monetary mistreatment. Right? That if I've stolen something from you, I can pay you back for it. I can fix it. Now, I might have a problem on my own because I've got this reputation as being a thief, God forbid, right? But if I say something that truly harms a person with my words, I may never, ever be able to fix that, right? Hopefully all of us are in therapy. I certainly am, right? Like we all have stuff that we're figuring out, that we're working on, and we're working through because of what someone has said to us, all of us. And if we're not working through it, maybe we should, that's a different conversation, right? Which is, words matter. Words matter, right? As I said last week when we started this, we know from the story of Bereshit, from creation, God speaks the world into existence. Our words create the same way. Okay, we've got a few minutes left. I want to open it up for a few thoughts. I know that there's a lot of us, so if you do have something to say, be succinct so that we can get as many people's opinions and we can still end on time. Yeah, David, and then Bill.
So I would agree and bring an example, which is this idea that we have these days, if you will, of verbal bullying. Many of us, when we were kids, were told sticks and stones can break your bones, but names can never harm you. as a way of trying to get you to just ignore the bully and the bully will give up and go away. But what was the struggle, if one was ever bullied, was that in fact you felt harmed. And sometimes you even felt like you couldn't talk about it, because if these things can't harm me, then maybe there's something wrong with me if I feel harmed. So I better just keep it inside and not talk about it. So it's like a double whammy of mental or emotional negativity. So when you learn these kinds of things a bit later on, it's actually, in a sense, empowering, but also instructive in the sense of behavior. So I just wanted to throw that out there, because I think we come at bullying, whether physical or verbal, differently than we maybe used to. And maybe if we paid a little more attention to the Gemara back then, even if those of us who were giving us that silly aphorism had well-meaning intent, maybe it would have avoided some pain.
Yeah, I mean, from this text in the Gemara, the rabbis would probably not have said sticks and stones and, words will never hurt you, because I don't think they believed that. That's a really nice example. Bill and then Nelson.
So I'm willing to read this completely the opposite way. I'm willing to say, as we know, as halakha ended up evolving, it's all about your actions. There's not the thought police. You don't have going to court based on what you're thinking. It's only on what has happened. And so intent is probably your last step in thinking before action. Monetary issues are action related. They're black and white. It's arithmetic. You can decide if something can happen. An intent to murder somebody carries no penalty. Carrying it through, murdering has a penalty in an earthly court. So I think when they say it's fear of God, that's their way of saying we really don't know how or if you actually will suffer for having a thought. But we want to instill a little fear, thought that you might, but we have no control over that. We really don't know. But what we can do is if it's demonstrable to the community that something transaction occurred, then we can take care of it that way. So in a way, I think it's a stronger. It's the only thing they can control, and it's therefore stronger.
Right. I just want to say two brief things. One is thank God for Yom Kippur, right? A chance for us to atone for our intents and things like that. And second, a reminder that our words are actions, right? It's not just something physical, but the way we communicate is an action. Nelson, Tybal, and then Karen, you're going to get the last word.
I've been the assistant Gabbai a number of services, and I came to understand my job as helping people not to embarrass themselves. My job was to direct them around the bima, though they maybe have never been there before, make sure they say the right prayers, do the right gestures, stand in the right place. And if they're trying to raise the Torah, teach them how to raise a Torah. And to do it in a way that didn't make it obvious that they were there for the first time.
I love that. Look, the rabbis took the concept of kavod, the way we honor one another, very seriously. And while embarrassment is on one end, right, the way we honor one another certainly exists on the other. Thanks for sharing that, Nelson. Tybal and then Karen.
I just wanted to respond. What Bill said made me think about one thing that I just wanted to toss in there. And again, it's more important for Christians who think they're only the Decalogue versus us that have 613. But the 10th one in the Decalogue is in fact not about action. It is about, however one would define it, thought or emotion, not to feel envy. So, and that's biblical. The rabbis did a bunch with it, but that just, as usual, the beauty of Judaism makes things much more complicated and interesting.
Judaism definitely likes to complicate things. And I would add that that last mitzvah that you made reference to is definitely more challenging, more complex on its than it is on its surface. But it's as a great example. Karen, give us your last word here.
All right, I just also wanted to respond to Bill. I think what this is about is the afterlife. Like, you may think you have gotten away with this because you haven't gotten caught, but God knows you did it, and you will eventually pay for it. I think that's what that whole thing, fear of God is God
Yeah,
knows
yeah.
better.
Absolutely. And now, I mean, and it even goes further, right? With this whole, which we didn't really dig into, this whole thing about Gehenna, right? This Gehenna, right? Like, actually, like all of us have some sort of purgatory experience, except for people who harm, who do these few things. So absolutely, the consequences are greater than they appear, right? I think as a section of Talmud that we've learned a few things together already, we can see that the implications are serious. The rabbis are not screwing around. They want you out in the world. They want you to understand that your actions have consequences, that the way we talk to each other, the way we act to each other matter. And as Bill said it, right? Like you can only control some part of your intention. You can only control your thoughts to some level. I know sitting in bed, laying in bed at the end of the day with all the thoughts running through my head, sometimes I wish I could control them better than I do, right? But how we act on those things, how we walk through the world, that stuff matters. It's as serious as somebody's death, right? It's as serious as killing somebody, right? That's what they're describing humiliation as. And so the rabbis in this section help us define this concept of ona'at dvarim, of verbal fraud, of verbal mistreatment, and make the stakes incredibly serious. And I think, especially when we live in a world that is more complicated, where we are absorbing more words than ever, right? With the internet and Twitter and newspapers, we're absorbing just an incredible amount of information. Those words matter. The way we share those words, the way we ingest those words, all of that makes an impact on who we are and the kind of people we want to be. So with that very light ending, I look forward to seeing you all next week at B'nai Yeshurun's Gemara class at noon on Thursdays. And I hope you have a wonderful Shabbat, everybody.
Yasher Koach, Shabbat Shalom.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.